Great, thanks. Yeah, Annie, and welcome everyone to session 10B on AI in the blue economy. This session is going to be hosted by myself, Benjamin Richards from the NOAA Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center, and then also Jordan Watson from the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center. We have 5 exciting talks today covering various aspects of artificial intelligence as it relates to reef fish, squid, oysters, coastline changes, hurricanes, and ecological time series. I have a few housekeeping details to cover while our first speaker, Aotian, cues up their slides. The first you'll see here is the code of conduct and etiquette. As I'm sure many of you have heard throughout the sessions this week, the NCAI is committed to providing the participants of this workshop with a safe, productive, inclusive, and welcoming environment for everyone. We encourage active but respectful discussions surrounding the advancement and promotion of AI in the Earth and space sciences. Harassment, intimidation, or discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated at the meeting. Those who violate the standards will be asked to leave the meeting. If you do feel at any time that you are experiencing any type of harassment, please email ai.workshop@noaa.gov, and we will have that taken care of as soon as possible. So with that, Jordan, anything you would like to add before we kick off our talks?
No, I think that covers it. Thanks so much, Ben. Looking forward to seeing everything you guys are going to show us.
Great. So our first talk, we have Aotian, who is a research engineer at Mississippi State University North Gulf Institute, affiliated with the NOAA Southeast Fisheries Science Center. And this talk will focus on CMAP D21, a large-scale reef fish data set for fine-grained categorization. So if you want to go ahead and take over presentation and share your screen, we look forward to your talk.
Yeah, sure. One correction though is that I am at the University of Washington, not Mississippi State University. So
my apologies. I had that's Océane is at Mississippi State University. You are indeed in University of Washington. My apologies.
Yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Océane Zhang, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Washington. Today, I will be presenting to everyone the CMAP D21 dataset and the work we're doing on this dataset with our collaborators from Mississippi State University and the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. So, fisheries are a multi-billion-dollar global industry that requires management tactics for long-term sustainability, and stock assessments are the backbone of successful science-based fisheries management. In situ camera systems for monitoring fish abundances have become a common practice in conservation ecology and stock assessment surveys. However, video footage from these systems are time and resource intensive for humans to manually review. Often, such analysis requires expert knowledge from marine biologists and fishery scientists. So, one way to reduce this huge cost is to take advantage of machine learning and computer vision to automate the video analysis process, obtaining information such as fish size and fish species much more quickly and at a larger scale. Here you can see an example of some of our previous and current projects done in collaboration with NOAA, including fish analysis underwater, on a rail fishing vessel, and in a chute. While machine learning is incredibly powerful and versatile, it requires lots of training data to perform well and be applicable to different scenarios. And here we present CMAP D21, the first large-scale fine-grained reef fish dataset from the Gulf of Mexico. It's available online at the GitHub link shown above and will be periodically updated as more data gets annotated. The primary objective of the annual Southeast Area Monitoring and Assessment Program, also known as CMAP, from which this dataset is derived, is to provide an index of the relative abundances of fish species associated with topographical features, for example, reefs, banks, and ledges located on the continental shelf of the Gulf of Mexico. The data for CMAP D21 is collected with a stationary camera array composed of 5 cameras, which together provide a 360-degree field of view, and you can look at this image. So the camera array is placed inside a cage for protection and is baited to track nearby fish during 30-minute long deployments. Today, 600 deployments are made annually. And here is an example of all 5 camera views side by side. Although each camera is pointed in a different direction, they have slight field of view overlap with adjacent cameras. And since deployments target habitats of the snapper grouper complex, the resulting distribution of species captured is very uneven and poses a challenge for stock assessment purposes. So you can look at this graph, which shows the number of occurrences by species. And so our current data contains 90,000 annotations and 130 annotated species. For automated fish surveys, our software needs to do 3 things. First is detection, which is to localize the fish objects in the image and draw a bounding box around them. Second is tracking, which is to associate detected fish between video frames and keep track of which detected object belongs to the same fish. And then third is classification, which is to classify the detected fish as one of numerous possible species. In the future, we also plan to take advantage of the multiple camera views in the deployment rig to perform length estimation on fish that appear in the camera's overlapping field of view. I'll first talk about some baseline experiments we performed for fish detection and species classification using several popular neural network architectures. For most experiments, they were performed using the open source code from OpenMMLab, specifically the MM detection and MM classification toolboxes. Both toolboxes provide a variety of neural network architectures, and for object detection, we use a 60-20-20 data split and only detect fish objects, not going down to the species level. For species classification, due to the lack of training samples for many species, we only train on the 54 out of the 130 species with more than 10 annotated individuals. Again, the data is split in a 60-20-20 ratio, but this time by track. So here a track means the set of all images of an individual fish. So this ensures that images of the same fish do not appear in both the training and validation sets, which would affect the evaluation of our model performance. Finally, the data is filtered by bounding box size and location to remove badly occluded and truncated images. Now, for those familiar with object detection, you'll know that classification is already part of the object detection problem. For example, a single object detection model can detect various types of objects such as cars, people, and bicycles. However, this only works well for objects with drastically different appearances. So we found from experience that for fine-grained categorization of fish species with strong interclass similarities, we obtain better performance using a separate model dedicated to classification rather than relying on the detector model for both detection and classification. Additionally, decoupling the detection and classification allows us to employ tactics for improving either task without affecting the other. And here is the detection performance for a variety of different architectures given in terms of mean average precision, or MAP. Here, precision is the proportion of detected objects that are correct, and detectors will output a large number of predictions ranked by their confidence score. Usually some method is used to select only a few of these predictions, such as taking the top K predictions or using a confidence threshold. Average precision is calculated by varying the number of predictions considered and then taking the average of certain resulting precision values. The mean of average precision is then taken over all classes. In our case, we only have one class, which is fish, and here on the right, we have an example of an easy detection scenario on the top, where the fish is clear and we can detect them easily, and then on the bottom is a more difficult detection scenario where there's a lot of sediment in the water, so the fish is heavily occluded and really can't. So if you squint really hard, you can kind of tell that there's a fish right there. So from these models we tested, our best MAP was 39.3 or 39.4, which is not very stellar. And also we have, for each of the models, we also have their FPS or frames per second. So this value here, there's not really much difference between most of them. And in a powerful GPU, there's this kind of difference isn't really worth considering. But if you want to employ this model on like deployment hardware where you have limited resources, or you have you're trying to process a lot of data at once, then this value becomes important for consideration besides just the MAP. And for classification, we have the top 1, top 5, and track accuracy presented. So top 1 accuracy only considers if the predicted most likely class is correct, whereas the top 5 considers if the correct class is in the top 5 most likely classes. So for track accuracy, a species is predicted for the overall track using majority vote based on the predicted species of each image in the track. The breakdown of classification accuracy by species is shown in the chart below. And our top 1 accuracy is only around 70% for these different models. And this is because it's rather limited by our heavily obscured images where only a fish outline can be seen, where it's very difficult to go down to a fine level species categorization because you just can't make out enough features. And finally, to obtain species counts, we also need to perform tracking after detection. So our tracking algorithm has 2 components, simple association, which forms the initial tracks frame by frame, and then track matching to combine those initial tracks that are fragmented. For simple association, we first estimate the velocity of each track with an exponential moving average, and then predict the current frame bounding box for each track using their estimated velocity. Additionally, we get the pixel color histogram of each detected object in the current and previous frame. So detected bounding boxes are assigned to tracks using the Hungarian algorithm, where the cost is the product triangle distance between the color histograms minus the IOU of the detected and predicted bounding boxes. So for track matching, we use 3 sets of cues. The first is spatial, temporal, and trajectory information. So for example, if the end of one track and the beginning of another track are close together in terms of their pixel location and also frame location, and if their trajectories are similar, then we can match them together as one track. And also the second set of cues is metal bar mask information. So as the fish is moving across the image, it gets occluded by the metal bars, and as it gets occluded, it generally breaks up the track as well. So we can train a neural network to then get a segmentation mask for the metal bars in the image, and then using the segmentation mask, we can say if a track ends at one side of a metal bar and then another track begins at another side of a metal bar, and they're pretty close together in terms of the frame number, then we can
2-minute warning.
Okay. So then we can say they probably should belong to the same track. And finally, we have a modified color histogram information, which is like I previously mentioned color histogram, except then we reweigh the bins based on the background pixel colors to suppress the bins associated with the background, and to get like a more accurate distribution that more closely represents the fish. And then we so average together like say the color histogram for 5 frames in the track and then compare them. And finally, here are our tracking results with based on 2 important multi-object tracking metrics, which is MOTA and IDF1. And MOTA is more sensitive to detection performance, while IDF1 is more sensitive to association performance. You can see that adding each of the 3 cues during the track matching improves our IDF1, but it doesn't really change the MOTA much since we're not really changing the detection. And finally, here is a tracking demo of a relatively so easy scenario where but there's still like abrupt motion of the camera and also abrupt fish movements, but we're still able to track them through these abrupt movements and as they're moving across the metal bars. And here is a more difficult tracking scenario where there's a crowded, where it's a very crowded scenario, and also there's more sediment in the water, so sometimes the fish gets very obscured and difficult to detect. So in conclusion, our data set has a large variety of backgrounds, water conditions, and lighting. So to train a consistent model requires annotated data from many different locations or the application of domain adaptation methods. And given the long tail distribution of CMAP D21, classification performance on rare, potentially important tail species can be enhanced with imbalanced classification methods. Finally, often poor visibility is too poor or pose is wrong for good species ID. So we can employ a hierarchical classification strategy to reduce the classification error from these bad images. And that's all for my presentation.
Great, thank you very much. And I will remind everyone in the chat box, you'll see a link to the Slack channel that we're using for question and answers for this session. So if anyone has a particular question, please do go ahead and type it into the Slack channel, and then we can continue the discussion both throughout the session and after the conclusion of the session. So with that, while people are thinking of questions, let's have Hakob go ahead and queue up the next presentation. This will be on detecting coastline change from high resolution satellite imagery using edge detection algorithms. Hakob has a BS in psychology and master's in military psychology from the Armenian State Pedagogical University, and completed a program in data science at General Assembly in Washington, D.C. So we really look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the introduction. So my name is Hakob Avjyan, and I am the lead data scientist at Graham Technologies. I'm going to do a quick introduction and talk a little bit about the motive behind the project before we start. So Graham Technologies was established in 2007, and we have been a trusted partner throughout the federal civilian, defense, intelligence, and national security ecospheres. Our team of innovative engineers provide agile software development, cybersecurity, data analytics, application modernization, cloud engineering, and AI/ML professional services to the U.S. government. So it is very exciting to see how Earth observations, cloud computing, and machine learning is enabling global development solutions. There are so many factors that are going to benefit the industry. The amount of high-resolution optical and radar imagery is increasing, and that increases competition in the marketplace for Earth observational data. There's a dramatic increase in temporal data resolution as well. And on the other hand, cloud computing is lowering data storage and compute cost, plus machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques to process Earth's observational data are improving results and dramatically reducing the time it takes to analyze Earth observational data. So I'll talk a little bit about the problem statement. So the coastal areas are very fragile landscapes. They are among the most vulnerable to climate change and impact of natural hazards. If marine abrasion is greater than the soil deposits, coastline erosion may occur and lead to the disintegration and demolition of the Earth's surface. As the pace of coastline change accelerates, there is a natural and great need for efficient and timely acquisition of coastline information. Coastline mapping and change detection are essential for safe navigation, resource management, environmental protection, and sustainable coastline development and planning. So this is our proposed solution. So in general, coastline change detection through analysis of digital image data belongs to boundary detection problem. And we used computer vision and image processing techniques to solve the problem that we have on hand. So edge detection and image segmentation are two conventional approaches to the boundary detection. In this particular use case, we utilized a Kenny edge detection algorithm on the satellite imageries acquired by OLI sensor on the Landsat 8 platform. And through this methodology, we were able to visualize and estimate the progress of the coastline erosion over time. We mostly used open source packages for our solution. OpenCV, which is a Python package, was used to apply Kenny algorithm. And then the scikit-learn, which is also a Python package, was used for image segmentation. So in this slide, you can see high-level architecture of the development pipeline that describes stage-by-stage methodology of the projects. Steps and action and tools are color-coded. The first stage, of course, in any project is problem definition and proof of concept development. And then next we go on data ingestion, image data ingestion. So we acquired our data from the USGS government website, from the Earth Explorer. Then comes next, the stage 3, we do image data preparation. Stage 4, we do image data segmentation. Stage 5, we train our model. This is when we apply the Kenny edge detection algorithm. Stage 6 is web application development. So we choose the candidate models to operationalize our AIML. Stage 7 will be cloud deployment. This is where we host our web app in cloud for compute resources. Stage 8 is building user interface that will consume our machine learning model, basically the front-end development. And then the last stage will be the performance monitoring. So we'll be overseeing the real-world behavior and collaborating accordingly. In the next slides, I will be talking more about stage 3, 4, and 5. So this is where AIML insertion happens in the development pipeline. So image preparation, also known as image pre-processing. For this particular project and proof of concept, we chose a region that is fastest eroding coastline region in Europe called Holderness Coast. First and foremost, we performed standardization of the images. The images that we acquired were grayscale images. And the standardization demonstrated that some bands are brighter than the others. However, this is not enough. So we needed to further enhance our satellite images. So we use RBG composite enhancement technique to obtain bands 4, 3, and 2. So this added color and clarity to our images. So as you can note, we have 2 separate images from the same coast. One dated in 2014, and the other one is dated in 2019. After that, we basically do the image segmentation. In computer vision, image segmentation is the process of partitioning an image into multiple segments. So the goal of the segmentation Segmenting an image is to change the representation of an image into something that is more meaningful and easier to analyze. It is usually used for locating objects and creating boundaries. In image segmentations, pixels which have similar attributes are grouped together. Image segmentation creates a pixel-wise masks for an object in an image, which gives us more comprehensive and granular understanding of the object. So we sample the images using k-means clustering algorithm. So the segmentation is done using this algorithm to discriminate between ocean and land mass. So this basically will allow our ML AI model to recognize, and draw the boundary lines better and recognize where the emerging land and water bodies are. And finally, for the next step, we apply the Kenny filter. So the Kenny filter is a multi-stage age detector. It uses a filter based on the derivative of the Gaussian in order to compute the intensity of the gradients. The Gaussian reduces the effect of noise presented in the image. Then potential edges are thinned down to 1 pixel curves by removing non-maximum pixels of the gradient magnitude. And finally, edge pixels are kept or removed using hysteresis thresholding on the gradient magnitude. So this allows us to obtain the gradient, extract the local maxima, and then apply the threshold with hysteresis for each acquisition. And this helps us to show the distinct lines between the segments. And then finally, we overlay both pictures from 2014 and 2019, and we can observe the differences in the coastline between the two photos. As you can see, in 2004, the coastline was basically right here, and then it deteriorated in 2019, and then the coastline is basically over here at the moment. So by utilizing AI/ML, we can easily streamline and scale satellite imagery analysis and detect coastline change. So Kenny algorithm is in its original pipeline works quite well, but its performance is based on the data that is involved. And our results yield a visual of two coasts over time, demonstrating the change in the profiles of the coasts through the methodology described above. There was also a demo for this project, but because the time is of the essence, we can anybody who wants, you can just follow the link and then see the demo there. So the next steps for this project, we're thinking about automating the tool and incorporating better visualizations of the final product. So incorporating time lapses, color coding. We're trying to also do caching of images, the images to increase compute time of popular images. And because the web app is hosted on the cloud, we can always scale up and scale out if the demand is high and there's more data available. This concludes my presentation, and thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to be part of this workshop. Thanks again.
Great, thanks, Hakob. We have one question from Jordan, actually. For regions with extreme tides, do you have to do any sort of resampling in order to develop some sort of mean coastline for your analyses?
Yes, we will definitely do resampling techniques. And then for sampling as well, Yes, the answer is yes. We'll need to do resampling.
Great, thank you very much. And then from Michael, can you post the link to the coastline detection web app here into the Slack channel so that people can reference in the future?
Yes, absolutely, will do. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, with that, we'll get ready for our next speaker, which is Slava Lipchik, who will be talking about machine learning factors related to production crashes at an oyster hatchery.
Hello, everyone. My name is Slava, and I'm a statistician and associate research professor at the Center for Environmental Science. My colleague, Matt Gray, is a bivalve ecophysiologist. I'm glad to present our ongoing work on understanding the factors behind production crashes at oyster hatcheries. Hatchery production underpins oyster aquaculture, fisheries augmentation, and ecological restoration, such as here in Chesapeake Bay, where our research center is located. Despite highly skilled and experienced staff running hatcheries, they experience periods of poor performance. Aside from low production levels, our partner research hatchery and other facilities also experience periods of acute mortality, also known as crashes. And overall, the reasons of those crashes largely remain unknown. The most common approach to managing the crashes is to simply flush bad water, clean tanks, and hope to refill tanks with good water so the production can resume. Our goal in this project was to identify most likely causes of low productivity, or at least associations that can help to provide solutions to the problem. And such solutions could include forecasting of the production crash and trying to avoid it, avoid the losses, or if possible, identifying the root causes of low productivity and eliminating them. What was great about partnering with the Horn Point hatchery is that they had a variety of data routinely recorded and digitized and made them available to us. Yes, many hatcheries still have their data written on paper inconsistently, or the data are not recorded at all. So we got lucky with that. The primary metric we analyzed was the yield, which is the percentage of oyster eggs that became eyed oysters by the end of the production period. The first model we built was for the average yield. We also looked at the lower tail of the yield distribution using quantiles. So the yield is a left-centered variable, and here we have a part of the cumulative distribution function. We see that at least 15% of the data are centered because when hatchery staff observe acute mortality, they just record the yield as 0 and don't measure every other oyster. So we chose a different quantile above that of 25% as the lowest quantile to look at. For comparative purposes, we also use the symmetric upper quantile, which is the 75th percentile. So that was the second response variable. The third response variable was the categorical variable, which is the quadrant to which the outcomes of the hatchery productions appear or end up. The quadrants are defined here based on the median production rate and production yield. And the best one is the quadrant number 1, which corresponds to fast and high yields. Production quadrant number 2 is not as good because it's slower and so on. And production quadrant 4 is the worst because this corresponds to low and slow yields. The hatchery shared with us data from 9 years, which we combined with environmental data on water quality parameters from a nearby water buoy. The 20 predictors covered all stages of production, and the sample sizes varied from 150 to roughly 500 because of the missing data. Some variables had many missing data, but when we excluded the variable from the model, we could evaluate the model again on a slightly bigger sample. Of course, the sample size is not as big as many other examples shared in this workshop, but while the production problems of hatcheries are really widespread, this is probably the best data set from a single hatchery countrywide. To model these 3 types of responses, we applied various random forest techniques for regression, classification, and quantile modeling. All analysis was done in R using these packages. We discovered that techniques for quantile random forests are not as developed and linked across packages, and there remain some inconsistencies of how quantile random forests are built and evaluated. We followed the approach of Mainshausen, where random forest is just the classical random forest in which all values of terminal nodes are recorded, not just the averages. We were able, however, to use caret package with our custom functions and metrics for tuning hyperparameters. We used R1 metric, which is the goodness of fit measure and an analog of R squared for classic L2 norm regression. Baruta algorithm was used in these 2 cases to select variables, so it uses multiple testing for importances, but no such off-the-shelf algorithm was available for quantiles. So we used the GRF package to count how many times each variable was selected for splitting the data, and then applied multinomial confidence intervals to check whether the selection proportions are significantly different from 0. For partial dependence plotting, random forest and plotmo packages were used, but to build such plots for specific quantiles, I wrote a tiny package, NML, which is available on GitHub for miscellaneous functions. This is the modeling pipeline we applied. Tuning was done using repeated cross-validation twice, but actually the second tuning didn't change parameters most of the time, so it didn't play a huge role in the retuning. And at the end, we provided partial dependence plots from all models. This table shows our results, which variables out of the 20 we removed during the tuning and the tuning outputs. For numeric response of yield, for out-of-sample predictions, we were able to reach R squared of 54%. Accuracy was 60%, which I would say is reasonable considering that we had 4 classes, 4 quadrants, and also many cases were on the borders, on the medians. The R1 metric for quantiles for the lower quartile was just 19% and higher of 31% for the 3rd quartile. The lower performance for the lower quantile can be explained, of course, by censoring of the data. And maybe this problem was exacerbated for certain combinations of covariates. Keeping in mind, of course, that the performance of our models is reasonable, but of course not superior, we can just look at general patterns using partial dependence plots such as these. And we can see on plots A and E, there is a strong relationship between yield and pH and water temperature for conditioning oysters in the tanks. There's also a sweet spot for salinity that can provide higher yields or corresponds to higher yields. There is also a strong relationship between yields and spawning variables. This is what Matt would be the best person to ask about, but fecundity, analytics, and average shell height of females, and so on. So some of these plots are some of these patterns are driven by only a few observations. So, for example, for chlorophyll and oxygen, for the water which was drawn from the environment, we see that some of these patterns on the ends are driven by only a few observations, so are not reliable. How these partial dependence plots are produced is by varying values of one variable while keeping others fixed. And at least one other way to construct such plots is by keeping the variables fixed at their median levels. So this is what the algorithm of plotmo does. It usually produces smoother plots, but they generally they generally agree with the previous method. So these are just some examples. When predicting categorical responses,
2 minutes.
Thank you.
2 minutes.
When predicting categorical responses, I would then switch to the next one. We could identify again sweet spots for combinations, especially using the plotmo algorithm for data reaching our best quadrant number one. And when looking at the quantile partial dependence plots, we could see the impact of each variable, for example, average salinity on yield or turbidity, and we see that average salinity is probably more important for predicting the lower quartile based on the higher range compared to lower range for predicting the third quartile, and reverse is true for turbidity of the water. The interaction plots also showed us sweet spots. This is an interesting plot, which unfortunately I don't have time for relationship of temperature, which was in the tanks, and oysters prefer cooler water versus the temperature which was for the water in the environment. In conclusion, our analysis of past production points to factors that the hatchery staff can manipulate and investigate further. The results are fully data-driven and highlight the importance of record keeping and data sharing, because most hatcheries experience similar problems. And some of the results have been published in a recent aquaculture paper. Our future work will be exploring predictive models for the crashes, with variables being leading indicators of production crash. And we will also increase, of course, the sample size with data at least from the same hatchery, but hopefully with data from more locations. And we'll also look at the joint importance of variables. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Slava. While Laura queues up her talk, we have one quick question from Jordan. Were you surprised to see such a small impact from chlorophyll, assuming that chlorophyll is representative of the food source?
Oh, I would like in our environment, I think chlorophyll would be also the indicator of algal blooms or something else bad in the water. So I have like mixed feelings towards it, but I think they feed oysters in the hatchery. So the chlorophyll that was presented here is just the chlorophyll when they just draw the water from the environment to the tank, but then they add the feed.
I see. Thank you very much. I will remind people as you do post questions in this Slack channel, if they are for a particular speaker, go ahead and use the @ symbol to tag that particular speaker, just so the person knows who should provide the response. All right, the next talk we have is Laura Ko talking about rapid hurricane intensification. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you. My name is Laura Ko, and I've been working on this project with Dr. Kuba, Xiaomin Chen, and Gopal. Our project the main goal is to develop a consensus machine learning model specifically for hurricane prediction. And the thing we want to predict is the hurricane intensity change, especially for rapid intensification. The definition of rapid intensification is when a hurricane intensifies more than 30 knots within 24 hours. And why is that important? So take a look of one of our recent hurricane happened this year. This was Hurricane Ida. And this video clip was from NASA, and I just borrowed the clip to show why is that important. Hurricane Ida this year had a very strong rapid intensification right before the landfall. So when this actually can happen anytime throughout the hurricane life cycle, but when it happens before landfall, before it makes landfall, it can largely shorten the preparation time in terms of maybe you need to evacuation people or et cetera, et cetera. And that's why NOAA put a lot of effort on investigating or modeling for rapid intensification. And traditionally, there are several numerical models can perform the prediction for RI, and there's also one of the famous statistical model called SHIPS, and which became the operation model since 2001, and it's the observational model for RI predictions. And here, what we are trying to do is to build a consensus model for the, excuse me, just 1 second. Okay, I hope you guys can hear me well because I just received a notification on my screen about my audio quality might be low.
No, perfect on this end.
Okay, sounds good. So about our project is to build a consensus machine learning model to perform RI prediction. And we are toward to the end of this workshop, so maybe you already have the general idea about how the machine learning model works. And usually you need to have good data because that's where your machine learning model can learn from. And the data we pick here is from Hurricane Weather Research and Forecasting Model Edgeworth. And since this project started 2 years ago, so the Edgeworth model we picked was from the 2018 version, and so-called H218. And in this specific version, it has the retrospective run covering the hurricane season from 2015 to 2017. We use these 3 years data for training purpose, and we also use the real-time data in 2018 for the verification. Then we use the real-time data from H219, which is 2019 version of Edgeworth system for testing. And in this project, we have 2 experiments. One is based on the analysis data, and the second one is based on the prediction data. Analysis data, you can view it as high resolution or graded observational data, which would be representing the ground truth of the current status of the atmosphere. And that would be really ideal if you want to predict the intensification or weakening or hurricane status in the next 24 hours. That would be great if we have the analysis data. However, during the real-time analysis data for this current moment is not available. you can simply think about that at this moment, they still need some time to collect the observational data and perform the data transmission. And then the model parts need to have the data assimilation before you can use this analysis data. So in other words, during the real time, using analysis data to perform the prediction for the next 24 hours is not realistic. So typically we use the prediction data from the model of the previous round. That's why we have this prediction data, F6 data, which means this F6 data is a forecast hour 6 data from the model round 6 hours ago. And then the algorithms we pick here are the classical machine learning algorithms, including logistic regression, k-nearest neighbor decision trees, random forest, simple vector machine, and artificial neural networks. And we use these 6 models to form this consensus machine learning model in order to perform our hurricane intensity change predictions. And for our predictions, we are not only trying to make the prediction for rapid intensification, the RI, we also want to know if the storm is weakening or it's staying the same similar status, which is neutral state, and or it's intensifying or undergoing RI. And here are the threshold of each class. And if you ever work with classical machine learning, you would probably already know that, oh, it's kind of not possible that you just throw the model forecast data or the analysis data directly into the classical machine learning model. In other words, we had to design the feature extractor to extract out certain features from the original actual graded data into the vector data. And these are the original 20 feature sets we had, and these are latitude, longitude, the intensity change in the past 12 hours, radius of maximum winds, sea surface temperature, shear, cape, helicity, relative humidity, divergence, convergence, temperature difference at certain area, and wave number 1 amplitude. We extracted out these 20 features from both analysis data and from prediction data. But with prediction data, from the actual prediction data, it also has the vertical field. So in the analysis data, it only has the 2D field. And the vertical field, you only can find them in the prediction data. So we took advantage of having prediction data, and we were able to expand the feature sets from 20 features to 34 features. So actually, instead of 2 experiments, we have 3 experiments here. One is the 20 feature set, 20 features from the analysis data. The second one is 20 features from the prediction data. The third one is the 34 feature sets from the prediction data. In terms of the prediction we are trying to make, traditionally we could have the deterministic prediction, which means if the hurricane intensify more than 30 knots, you would just label it as RI. So it would be 100% fall into this category. In our study, we took advantage of the uncertainty of the best track data. Sorry, let's roll back a bit. In order to train the machine learning model, we need the ground truth. And our ground truth is based on this best track data set provided from National Hurricane Center. And if you ever work with this data set, you would probably heard of there's uncertainty in this best track data set. Means if the best track data says the current intensity is 0 knots, there's no wind. Let's say maybe 30 knots, the current intensity is 30 knots. And there's about 23% of chance the actual wind speed is maybe plus 5 knots, which is 35 knots or 25 knots. And there's also 10% of chance to be 40 knots or 20 knots. So we implement this uncertainty to form our probabilistic observation. Instead of labeling our ground truth that is 100% RI, it would become 68% of RI and 32% for intensification class. And so now our ground truth become probabilistic ground truth. So our prediction would be probabilistic as well. So we talk a little bit about the data set we have and what kind of feature we extracted. Another thing I want to mention here is about the resampling data. So to perform resampling for any data set for machine learning is actually pretty common because a lot of things we are interested in are rare events. For example, our RI, the thing we want to predict is the RI storm, which only happen about 5 to 8% of time throughout the one hurricane season. That's why the data set itself is so-called imbalanced, which means our training case number for RI case, the number is smaller than the case number for weakening case. So we use edited nearest neighbor. Oh, okay. Edited nearest neighbor to perform undersampling to remove some of the cases from weakening storm. And we use borderline mode to generate synthetic data for RI cases. Then we use these 6 algorithms to form this consensus machine learning model. Let's quickly take a look on the results. This is a lot of information to take in within 2 minutes, I understand. So let me try to walk you through this. On the left-hand side is results for RI cases. On the right is for the intensifying cases. Because of time, so we can simply quickly take a look on the blue bars here, which is the recall rate. And the red and orange-ish bar is the false alarm ratio. And each bars represents each experiment I mentioned. So our results shows that analysis data set actually represent better for the RI forecast than the forecast data from the 6-hour forecast data. However, when we expand the data set, the POD rate, the recall rate doesn't really change much, except for maybe for random forest, it's slightly higher. What's good about the extension data set is the FAR, the false alarm ratio, actually dropped a lot. And we combined all the selected machine learning algorithms and formed this consensus machine learning model. The FAR is the lowest compared to other algorithms. And similar things we can find in the intensifying cases. And here is, I'm quickly showing that this is where our model stands, and these are other operational models. And although our FAR rate is still close to 50%, but we have the highest POD rate. And let's just skip to the takeaway point that analysis data seems to convey better information for RI prediction, but increasing feature space can largely reduce the FAR. And so this is from the last slide that I didn't show that actually, if we want to make this model as an operational model, we have to retrain this model with a more recent data sets instead of just the 2015 to 2017 data sets. And that's all I have.
Great. Thanks, Laura. In the interest of time, I think we're going to move on to Caitlin's talk, but there are a couple of questions in the Slack channel that I will direct people to. And if we do have time at the end of the session, we'll circle back with questions for any of the speakers. So with that, let's move on to Caitlin Axelrod, who will be talking about ecological time series data. Go ahead, Caitlin.
All right, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So This is a working group working on looking at issues and best practices in machine learning with ecological time series data. We are a group of folks from NOAA and academia who are working together on a number of different data sets and trying to come up with a set of issues that are common across different data sets, primarily in fisheries, but generally for ecological data. So machine learning is one tool of many, and tools are useful for some things, but not others. So machine learning can be really useful when we're doing prediction. When we have reasonable confidence, prediction can be done with information from the past. It can be risky when we're trying to do extrapolation. So we can certainly extrapolate if patterns hold, but some machine learning methods fail when we're trying to predict extremes or outside the known zone, and that is impossible for tree-based methods. Also, machine learning is less useful for understanding mechanisms. So variable importance, we'll talk a bit about later. They're not nothing, but they're not as potentially informative as, say, marginal effects from something like a regression model. So in this talk, we're focusing on prediction, predicting spotting biomass, or predicting run size or recruitment events, as opposed to statistical inference, which is more based around achieving understanding of a system. All right. So ecological data, what they look like, at least to us in fisheries. Often we have a limited amount of data. We have short or wide data, we have sparse data, and we have structure in our data, which a lot of times looks like autocorrelation. So limited amount, we might have just one estimate per year, or sometimes one estimate over a particular area, or if we're lucky, one estimate over a particular area per year. On the right here is one of the most data-rich fisheries, it's pollock. We've got not quite 14,500 rows of data. That's not a lot compared to the oodles of rows of data that are typically used in machine learning. And then we've got short and wide data. So here's an example. We've got 29 years of data, which is actually quite a lot, with 2 seasons. So we've got 57 rows of data. We've got 9 possible predictors for not very many rows of data. And they're quite sparse. So we've got a lot of NAs in our predictors. Some, are not sampled in the last few years that we have. Some are only sampled in one season and not others. For some of them, there's a long lag time because you're sorting samples in a lab. And so you just don't get that data quickly. In terms of autocorrelation, numbers this year are correlated with the numbers from last year. So the number of age 3 salmon is related to the number of age 2 salmon because age 3 salmon come from age 2 salmon. And fish move around. So where you are is linked to where you've been. Brian Stock et al. 2019 paper showed that including spatial locations of fishing offered considerable improvements for RMSE for many species, particularly in a random forest model. So including spatial structures can be really important. And the importance of dealing with autocorrelation is to prevent data leakage or overfitting. So in ecological data, every row is not independent and identically distributed IID. There's structure in the data. It can be spatial or temporal or both. So pure randomization doesn't work. So in dealing with some of these issues, we've got a limited amount of data, short and wide data or sparse data. I'll talk about hyperparameter tuning and doing a best model check. And then autocorrelation, I'll talk about temporal autocorrelation and doing a rolling start. So for sparse data problems, for example, you need to think about how big of a grid of hyperparameters over which to test your model. There is a direct trade-off of larger grid with the amount of time it takes to run. think about how many trees you might need, say if you're doing a random forest, and what's the minimum number of data points you need in a node. And for that, you check your data distribution. All right, so an important diagnostic to know how you're doing. Is the random forest reaching what's sort of considered a stable point? So are you making the same average prediction regardless of increasing number of trees? This is an example for random forest. Therefore getting a stable RMSE, root mean squared error, right? So in the left here, this is what we would expect to see. You're getting some stabilization through time despite the increasing number of trees. On the right here, clearly not getting a stable answer even with increasing lots and lots of trees. And then for doing a best model check, so what you would do is after you do your hyperparameter tuning, you find your best model fit, you fix those values, and then you would run your random forest a bunch of times. When you have limited or sparse data, the chances of getting a good model fit sort of by luck or chance seem to be a little bit higher. And so by doing this check, you can see the range of RMSE values. So you're running those fixed hyperparameters a bunch of times, see what the range is, and then ask, is that range okay? And that's somewhat up to you. So if you're doing prediction, what amount of uncertainty are you willing to accept? So for some fisheries, plus or minus 30 metric tons isn't a big deal. For some fisheries, plus or minus 2 metric tons is a really big deal. So it depends on the data that you're working with. If time is important, something you want to do is set up rolling resampling. So in this example, resample 2 randomly samples your predictors in your training set from the first 2 years, resample 3 from the first 3 years, so on and so forth. So as you're fitting each of these slices, you're avoiding having information from the future bleed into the past, right? And that helps prevent that overfitting issue. Performance metrics, a lot of different ones. Some popular ones in our group are R-squared, root mean squared error, variable importance plots, and partial dependence plots. They are important, but we have to be careful with those. So I'm going to talk about those two for a minute. Variable importance is different from coefficient values. So sometimes people think they have the same rank as coefficients, but that's true only if there's no interactions between the variables. So this is where coefficients differ from variable importance. So the advantage on one hand of machine learning is it finds interactions even if we can't see them. But these importance plots, they help you find those interactions, but they don't give you everything. So Dan Ovando has a really nice example that he's created. So you've got this true model of a system right here. If you fit a linear regression model to these data, you might be wrong if you forget to include this interaction between Z and W. If you get the model right, then you're going to get the correct parameter values. But it depends on the user correctly specifying the structure, right? So alternatively, you could use random forest, for example. So that should learn about the interaction between Z and W here. So you don't have to specify as the user, you don't have to know about it ahead of time. But what if we want to understand that model and make predictions? Can we look at the importance scores? Right, so the correctly specified linear regression correctly captures the effect size of each of the parameters here. Right, so Z is the most important parameter. But if we look at the importance scores, it looks like W is the most important variable. So this is because it's important to know W in order to make a good prediction, but not because W itself has a large individual effect on the outcome. But in a management situation, it's possible to misinterpret this and say, oh, if I want to affect the outcome, the most important thing to do here is to change W, when really, in fact, it's to to change Z. It's just that there's an interaction here between Z and W. All right. So the data that you're using to train and test really matter. In machine learning, it's all about how good was your testing regime, how well does your testing set match your intended use. So if you're testing model performance, you're going to require different methods. If you, for example, want to predict the next step in time, you might set things up one way. If you want to predict in the same time, but maybe a different area, you might think about setting things up differently. Or if you want to fill in missing values, but not predict forward in time, these are all different methods you might use. So here's an example where in this case, you're trying to predict the status of fish stocks using their catch history. So depending on what testing set you use to evaluate your model, you're going to reach a very different conclusion about model performance. So observed versus predicted on the training will give you this very optimistic assessment of performance. Leave one out gives a more realistic assessment if we're not asking the model to extrapolate to a new context. And if our goal is to use the model in, say, a new country, projecting somewhere else, performance would probably be fairly poor. So it's going to degrade even further. All right, so just thinking about prediction, it becomes problematic in light of long-term ecological shifts.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Trying to predict outside the known zone because many machine learning methods use a form of averaging. So here's an example from Jordan Watson. We've got these data sets here, and the nature of the data is changing in these female salmon returns compared to these males that maintain some variance through time. So an AI model might pick up these unknown interactions, whereas a structural model might struggle with this change. So pros and cons to using machine learning methods. Prediction of dome-shaped behaviors can be problematic if you haven't seen the other side of the dome. So for example, thinking about thermal tolerance in relation to climate change. So extrapolating beyond what we've seen so far can be problematic. So just in summary, best practices use a rolling start if you have temporal autocorrelation. Think about spatial clustering for spatial correlation. If you've got these ecological data problems, think about your hyperparameter grid, how many different combos of values you're going to test over, and do that final check, and look at it with increasing numbers of trees. Performance metrics, use a variety of metrics and be aware of the interpretation of importance. And remember that there are important caveats to keep in mind when doing prediction, especially if there are long-term changes through time or you're predicting outside the known zone. All right, and that's it for me. Thanks so much. Please send me an email, send me a Slack message if you have questions. Looking forward to hearing from you all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. That was a great closeout to our session, which ended pretty much exactly on the dot. So I want to thank everyone for adhering to the time and for all of your wonderful presentations. I will direct everyone to the Slack channel. There are a number of questions there waiting for answers. And also, I do want to take a moment to pitch our next session for AI in the Blue Economy, session 11B, which will be starting here in about 45 minutes. Jordan, any closing comments from you?
No, I would just second that this was a great, really broad, comprehensive overview of some different things happening in the blue economy, and I look forward to continuing that comprehensive overview after lunch.
Great, sounds good. So enjoy your lunch and come back right afterwards to hear more about acoustics, autonomous vehicles, ocean circulation patterns, Arctic seals, and the inner ear bones of fish.